G'day guys, welcome to today's video review of 2020 Best Picture Academy Award nominee, The Irishman. We start in a retirement home and an old man in a wheelchair. This is Frank Sheeran, played by Robert De Niro, remembering back on his life. We cut to Frank when he was a bit younger, taking Russell Bufalino, Joe Pesci, and their two wives on a road trip for 3 days to attend a wedding, as Russell doesn't like to fly. They stop for a cigarette break, as Russell doesn't allow smoking in his car, near a gas station diner, and remember back to when they were much younger and they first met there. Frank was a truck driver running some kind of meat scam. He gets busted stealing the meat and visits a lawyer, Bill Bufalino, played by Ray Romano. He gets him off the charge and Bill introduces him to Russell. Frank was in the war and he and Russell discuss it as he was based in Italy. He starts working for Russell. Russell is obviously a mob boss. Frank beats up a shop owner for pushing his daughter, which she witnesses, and she starts to become sus on what her dad does. Frank then gets hired to torch a rival laundry business. He gets summoned to go see the mob bosses, Angelo Bruno, Harvey Keitel, and Russell. It turns out Angelo owns the other laundry. Frank then kills the guy who hired him to torch Angelo's laundry. Frank then becomes a hired hitman and starts dating a new girl. Russell then suggests that Frank go and work for Jimmy Hoffa, played by Al Pacino. Jimmy Hoffa is the head of the Teamsters, the largest union in the US. Frank's first job is to go and sort out a taxi company who are hiring non-union labour. He pushes all their cabs into the river and reports back to Jimmy, who's happy with the quality of Frank's work. Frank and Jimmy's families become friends, and Frank's daughter likes Jimmy, unlike Uncle Russell, who she doesn't trust. The mob couldn't borrow money from the banks to build casinos, so they'd borrow money from Jimmy Hoffa and the union's pensions fund. The mob then helps JFK become president on the promise that he's going to get Castro out of Cuba so they can get their casinos and boats back. When he gets in, JFK assigns his little brother Robert Kennedy to Chicago and Attorney General. He goes after Jimmy Hoffa and the mob that helped get him elected. Jimmy Hoffa is starting to lose it as the FBI are following his every move. Russell then gives Frank a job of smuggling weapons to Florida, and then the Bay of Pigs incident happens. Frank goes to Florida and his daughter knows that somehow this is dodgy. Jimmy introduces a new second in charge, Fitz, who Frank doesn't trust. Meanwhile, Tony Pro, who runs a local chapter of the union, is giving them a bad name as he threatens people. Jimmy wants Frank to run for president. Frank then becomes the president of the 326 union. We cut to Jimmy Hoffa in court and someone tries to shoot him during his trial. Frank then comes to Jimmy Hoffa after the shooting. Back in Hoffa's hotel room, the lawyers are looking through the jurors to see who may be corruptible, and then they start buying off the jurors. The JFK murder comes on TV and everyone's stunned. Robert Kennedy is no longer Attorney General. Hoffa gets convicted and goes to jail for 4 years. Fitz is now running the Teamsters, but he's a pushover with the mob. Russell tells Frank to shoot up the accountant's car to send a message to Fitz. Tony Pro goes to jail for extortion and ends up in the same prison as Jimmy Hoffa. Tony's ill-gotten gains are gone, but Jimmy still has his. Tony demands that Jimmy do something about his money. They have a standoff. Tony attacks Jimmy in the prison. Back on the outside, we get introduced to the new generation of gangster, Crazy Joe. They're at a cabaret nightclub for Joe's birthday. Joe comes over to Russell and insults him. Frank tries to smooth it over by telling him you can't say that, Russell's a boss, and young, naive, Crazy Joe snaps back that he's a boss too. Frank and Russell look at each other and both know what needs to be done. Frank then prepares his weapons and plans a hit on Crazy Joe. Frank then disposes of Crazy Joe and the guns. Nixon gets in as president and Jimmy Hoffa gets a presidential pardon. After a substantial financial contribution to his campaign, of course. When Jimmy gets out, he wants his union back. Fitz is running for president, so they have to go to Tony Pro to get the votes they need. Frank and Jimmy go to see Tony. Tony wants an apology from Jimmy. They end up in a fight again. Jimmy and Frank then discuss getting the okay from Russell and the mob bosses to take out Tony. The bosses tell Frank to try and calm Jimmy down. Jimmy then goes to the press to badmouth Tony and Fitz. A tit-for-tat then starts with them sending messages to each other through explosions. Frank tries to tell Jimmy to calm down his public rhetoric as instructed by the mob bosses. Frank is then going to be honoured with an award from the union and wants Jimmy to present it to him. Fat Tony, one of the bosses, and Russell talk as Jimmy is talking about holding back loans, and when he gets back in as president, is going to call in all the old loans, and the mob has to do something to stop him. Russell then goes to have a quiet word with Jimmy. Russell tells Jimmy to quietly go away and enjoy his retirement. Jimmy then tells Russell that he's insulted by Tony Pro and that no one threatens Jimmy Hoffa, and refuses to relinquish his claim on the union. Jimmy then gets up and does his presentation speech to Frank, and Russell gives Frank a ring, making him a made man of the mob and ensuring his allegiance with Russell over Jimmy. Russell tells Frank that he's got to plead with Jimmy to shut up and go away as the mob bosses want. Frank's daughter watches everything from the shadows, and she's been suspicious of Frank's job ever since she was a child. Frank then tries to tell Jimmy not to mess with the mob, but Jimmy says that he's got proof of their nefarious activities and for them not to mess with him. Jimmy is stubborn and says that this is my union and he won't budge. We now catch up in real time to the car trip at the start, with Frank and Russell going to the wedding primarily to sort this stuff out with Jimmy once and for all. But Jimmy refuses to sit down with Tony Pro. Frank calls Jimmy back later and he says he's changed his mind and decided that he will meet with Tony Pro. Frank tells Jimmy that he'll be there by tomorrow so he can attend the meeting with him. That night at dinner, Russell tells Frank there's a change of plan and we're going to stay here. We've done everything we can for Jimmy, and he tells Frank not to call Jimmy and tell him. Russell tells Frank that they're going to dispose of Jimmy either way, and so he can either be involved or not. Frank then takes a charter plane to Detroit. A gun and car are waiting for him at the airport. He goes to a house and gets Tony's offsider and Jimmy's son. Then they go to the meeting spot where Jimmy is supposed to be meeting with Tony Pro. Tony, of course, never showed, and Jimmy's about to leave. When he sees his son and Frank rock up, he's calmed when they tell him there's a change of plans and that Russell and Tony Pro are back at a house and he's to come with them. They arrive at the house and Jimmy and Frank go inside. As soon as Jimmy realises that there's no one there, he says, "Let's leave," and then Frank shoots him in the head. Frank returns by charter plane to Russell. The next day they go to the wedding as if nothing's happened. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa is now all over the news. We then cut to Frank at home with his family watching TV. His daughter knows something's up. We cut back to old Frank in the retirement home, telling his story, saying that his daughter never spoke to him from that day onwards. Frank calls Jimmy's wife Jo and bumbles over what he says to her. We then cut to the removal of Jimmy Hoffa's body by the mob, and he's put in an incinerator. Anyone related to Jimmy was questioned. Tony Pro ended up in jail. Sally, Tony Pro's offsider, gets taken out by Frank. Fat Tony goes down for income tax evasion and gets diagnosed with prostate cancer. And Russell goes down for conspiracy to kill a witness over a different matter. Frank gets 18 years in prison for receiving a car and a bribe. Frank and Russell end up old men together in prison. Russell laments what happened with Jimmy and says that he picked him and Frank over Jimmy. Russell dies in jail. Frank gets released as an old man who can now barely walk. He goes to see his daughter at her work, but she still refuses to talk to him. He goes and sees his other daughter and says that he wasn't a great dad, and she agrees. He then goes coffin shopping and picks a burial spot. The FBI come to visit Frank and tell him that everyone related to Jimmy Hoffa except him is now dead, including his lawyer, and that now's the time for him to tell them what happened. He still says that he can't help them. He then goes to see a priest and kinda tries to make a confession. Frank looks through some photos from his youth and of his children, and then the priest comes to visit him in the home. He says he'll be back after the Christmas holidays to see him again. Frank closes his eyes, and the movie ends. The title, The Irishman, could relate to two characters in this film, Robert De Niro's Frank and/or JFK. All I knew of Jimmy Hoffa before this movie was the theory that he was buried in the end zone of a football field, so it was very interesting to deeply explore the subject. The story's told over several decades, and as such, has some of the most amazing de-aging CGI you'll ever see. The de-aging of Joe Pesci and Al Pacino are flawless, but with Robert De Niro there was some uncanny valley moments that took me half the movie to realise that it's old man eyes on a young face. I think De Niro's eyes have gotten cloudier as he's gotten older, and there's just something about his eyes that in every CG'd scene he was in, it just looked wrong and was distracting. This is definitely a Martin Scorsese movie. It was 4 hours long, but this review's only 10 minutes, shorter than some of my other reviews of movies half as long. This is because the scenes are given a lot of time to breathe. If this was made by any other filmmaker nowadays, it would have been an hour and a half shorter. And this could have very well been. But, as this is potentially the last time you'll ever see De Niro, Pesci and Pacino all have scenes together in a Scorsese movie, then in some ways you wish it went on longer. This is not the best Scorsese movie ever. Everyone's got their own favourite, but I'd still rate Goodfellas way higher than this, which is similar subject matter and actors, but nonetheless, this was the sort of quality production that you rarely get to see nowadays, and I'm glad it found a home at Netflix where Scorsese was allowed to indulge. So my rating for The Irishman is 6.5 out of 10 stars. Thanks for watching today's video. Only one to go in the 2020 Academy Award Best Picture series. Make sure to like, share, subscribe and comment. Have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy.